All right, thank you. I'm going to just do a little introduction while we're waiting for the rest of the people to come in from lunch because they're eating slow, but that's okay. But let me just introduce you. The actual class that you will be getting credit for is on the CD. So we're giving you the CD because that's a 5.5 credits, a long course. With me, Professor Guerra, and Professor Igaltua for University of Puerto Rico. The three of us, and we're discussing the status, Puerto Rico, history of the island, and it's from a constitutional matter, the territorial clause and what that means, and there's a whole discussion on the legal cases that have gone before the United States Supreme Court and the current status politically and legally of Puerto Rico. So these are the CDs that you'll be receiving for the purposes of getting credit, all right? And you've already paid for it because that's what you hear. And for those of you who are not lawyers, you can get it for free, okay? That's what I sold. So that's what you want. Let me introduce a gentleman who is an eminent scholar. I first met him when I traveled to Puerto Rico to introduce myself to the dean of the University La Católica en Pontifica de Puerto Rico, and Professor Guerra was then the constitutional law professor there. We became friends, and then years later when I wanted to do the moot court competition, which for those of you who don't know, when I was president of the bar, and under the first year under the presidency and administration of Richard Robles, who's with us here today, we did the very first moot court competition. And what we were trying to do was involve people who are not Puerto Ricans to understand the issue of Puerto Rico by creating a moot court competition like law schools have. All the questions were proposed, and the research was done by Professor Guerra. So the way I would create a concept, a question, the brief, the trial brief for the judges was prepared by Professor Guerra. So that was the perfect answer. And then we invited schools to participate and we had 4 competitions over the years. Over 15 law schools participated eventually in these competitions, and it was just tremendous success. Now, of course, since then, the United States Supreme Court has made the final decision on the question of sovereignty of Puerto Rico. We now know Puerto Rico has no sovereignty unless the federal government has its promesa board, as we learned earlier today. So it seems that Puerto Rico has sovereignty whenever le conviene al gobierno federal. Okay, so that's a question we will perhaps deal with in a future moot court, because I think that perhaps one of the things that we can tackle next in a moot court competition, assuming you young bloods take the board by the horns, is the question, and correct me if I'm wrong, Professor, the United States signed a treaty in the United Nations saying that Puerto Rico was not a colony and thus not in violation of United Nations rules on colonies, right? Is that correct? All right, and now that the United States Supreme Court has indicated that Puerto Rico has no sovereignty, it would appear to me that the question of of Puerto Rico's colonial status might be new on international law, right? So if that's the case, then perhaps what we can do is do a moot court on international law on the issue of whether or not Puerto Rico is a colony or in violation of international law. What do you think of that?
That's fascinating. Yes. That's fascinating.
So now, getting to the question of what we're doing today. We're not covering what was on the CD, all right? That you can watch it on your own. So what we're going to do today is work on a paper that was recently published. Well, I don't know if you published this yet.
Well, it's under review.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's under review. I have it with me. I really suggest you get your hands on it. It is fascinating reading. Even for non-lawyers, it is fascinating reading. But he calls it the Breaking Puerto Rico's Political and Legal Condorcet Cycle. And it is fascinating paper. You're really going to enjoy it. We're going to spend 20 minutes, 25 minutes discussing this idea and then we'll take some questions before we move on to our next panelist. All right, so Professor, explain to me, what is a Condorcet cycle, and what are you talking about?
Oh, wonderful! And this is not something that it's one of these it's actually it's what we call a voting paradox. And I'll give you an example that happened just 2 days ago. The WNBA, the Women's National Basketball Association MVP award. So Breonna Taylor ended up winning the award, but the top three candidates, another lady, Aja Wilson, actually got more second place votes, and another player got the more first place votes. And what happened there was, it's funny that the player that didn't get the most first place or second place votes ended up winning the MVP award. And I will tell you, by the way, all three players deserve the award. I thought it should have been, if you appoint me commissioner of the WNBA, which I would love that job, by the way, I would leave academia for that. I would have just said, I would have made a special dispensation to make up a new rule, figure out a way to give all three of the players, from the Connecticut Sun, New York Liberty, and the Las Vegas Aces the award. But what's interesting is the reason why Breonna Taylor won the award was because the WNBA assigns points to, if you get a first place vote for MVP, you get 10 points, and if you get a second place vote, you get 7 points, and if you get a third place vote, you get 5 points. And so that's, by the way, this paper was written well before this WNBA happened two days ago, when the award was announced. And so I felt excited. I blogged about it. I even, it brought it back to Puerto Rico. And this paper, it's now currently under review.
So what the paper is about is how to do what we might call weighted voting,
Exactly.
right? About weighted voting or rank voting.
Rank voting.
All right? In New York City, they recently had rank voting for the mayor.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So now tell me, how would rank voting be pertinent to the question of the status of Puerto Rico?
Yeah, and this is fascinating. This is why I love the WNBA so much, because, by assigning points to each of the, but here's the thing about Puerto Rico, a little background, and it's all on the video. Although on the video, on the CD, although we talk about, both the legislative and the judicial, developments going back to the 1898 Treaty of Paris. And now I should say, as an aside, my current research project revolves around pre-1898. What can we learn both from the United States Northwest Ordinance and from the Spanish, Spanish law as well, how that can inform our understanding. But going back, here's what I'd like to solve the impasse, right? Up until just a few years ago, whenever there was a referendum or plebiscite, the Commonwealth would get a lot of votes. Now, statehood is getting a lot of votes, and people on the Commonwealth side are abstaining from voting. And so I was thinking, how can we have a sort of a fair, because the thing about democracy is, even if you disagree with someone, like on the Commonwealth status or statehood status or independence, everybody should have a voice and everybody's vote should count equally. But the Condorcet paradox can rear its ugly head whenever you have three choices. So whatever the most, and one way of breaking the impasse is, okay, well, let's count first place and second place. And what's interesting is that, and here's I explain the paper. By the way, it's very rare for this to occur in real life. But what's really interesting, if you ask like a real, I'll say a red-blooded Commonwealth, their symbol is the color red, la pava, they love Commonwealth first, or free association, but as a second choice, they still want to remain with the U.S. Many would say, well, if I had to then be forced to choose between independence and statehood, I would probably pick statehood as my second choice. Then you have the estadistas, right? You know what I mean? La Palma, the blue-blooded. And, they would say, of course, we want statehood. We want equality, right? We want political dignity. We want representation in the Senate and the House, election of the Electoral College. And, of course, but for their second choice, independence, right? Because we would rather be independent than be a second-class colony. You know what I mean? Second-class citizens. And then, of course, if you ask independentista, the green-blooded, green-blooded friends, and of which I have many, being in academia, of course they want independence. But they're so anti-U.S. that they would probably and you see this, right? The so-called melon fellow, what they call in Puerto Rico, los melones, right? The ones that, well, I'm going to vote strategically for the Commonwealth because that's how much I hate statehood,
Right.
I don't want to be part of the U.S. And so what that does is, and I explained it in the paper, right? It's like the NWNBA, right? You have the person that gets the most first place votes, doesn't win, and so you have this, the technical term is cycling, and I have to say, this goes back to two great thinkers. I didn't come up with this. Mr. Condorcet himself, but Duncan Black and Kenneth Arrow,
Right.
two of the greatest thinkers in the 20th century on voting. And so what I wanted to propose was, well, if we do something like the WNBA, or if we allow voters themselves to assign their own points. Now, maybe that's a way of breaking the impasse, Can we find a voting system?
Okay, so let me see if I can make it clear. Because sometimes you talk like a professor. Okay.
My bad.
By the way, talk about that. When I was a professor at teaching at Barry University Law School, the person who was grading me was him. Okay. So, but I have a tendency to speak more like a politician than the great. This man is brilliant. So let me break it down. Okay, we biggest problem we have in Puerto Rico is that we have three choices, right? In fact, some of the bills that is pending now in the federal legislature doesn't have the support, for example, of Senator Rick Scott, because he doesn't like the current three options. He wants two options. So if you have two options, and then everybody may not agree. We will not have a plebiscite. If you have all three, then everybody doesn't. Oh no, that's not good enough. So the problem there is that by putting three options, it creates a problem that the bill will not pass Congress. So is there a way to have three options on the ballot and still come up with a winner and not have the problem? He has discovered, well, we just go through his work, what he calls the Bayesian, right? The Bayesian way of it, by scoring it by points. What's interesting is that it now allows what he was saying, how the estadista votes and how the independentista votes, how the Commonwealth, that way they have a certain amount of passion, right? A passion for one or the other and the other one. So what if you had a vote and you assigned points? Okay, my first independentista, 10 points. Next, Commonwealth, 5 points. Last, statehood, 3 points. You're a stateholder. 10 points for statehood, 7 points for independence, 3 points for Commonwealth. Then you collect them all, and whoever wins the most points wins the plebiscite. Now, okay, right? All right, does everybody understand that? Does everybody understand that? Okay? If you don't understand, I understand why you don't understand. But we'll try to make it. Go ahead, Chris.
It's possible that the second favorite, it might not be the number one that
Right.
actually ends up becoming law, but it might be what everyone sort of settles on.
Professor.
Exactly. The WNBA, right? Breonna Taylor won the MVP, even though she didn't get, not only she didn't get the most first place votes, she didn't even get the most second place votes, right? But she got enough votes overall that she won. And that's a risk. And by the way, a quick timeout, like if everybody, in Puerto Rico, they call it a come fuego, right? If you are like really passionate, hardcore, right? If you're statehood, you're going to get all 10 of your points. Now, what I do, by the way, in my paper is a little bit different than the WNBA. WNBA, however, and this is the preference ranking, for 10 points for first place, 7 points for second place, and 5 points for third place. What I do is, no, you only get 10 points. You're a voter. You get 10 points, and you can allocate those points towards. So if you give 7 points to statehood, you only have 3 points left over for the other two options. Now, if everybody's a come fuego, right? If everybody's voting 10 points for their favorite option, then basically we're back to where we started, right? My solution it doesn't really do anything. What I'm hoping is, and from my own, I lived in Puerto Rico for many years. I consider it my home. It's my favorite place. It's where I want to retire. I have a feeling there are a sufficient number of voters that would vote non-strategically, that would probably say, okay, I'm going to give 5 points to independence and 5 points to statehood, you know. And as long as you have a sufficient number of people who are voting honestly, you know what I mean, who really, you know, not, you know, and by the way, people are voting passionately. I think that's an honest vote, and they're perfectly allowed to vote, you know, assign all 10 points to their favorite option. You know
Okay,
what I mean?
so now we've explained this, okay? What I would like to do is get some info. We've put microphones at the end of the table. So now that we explained this, I would like to see what you have there, because this is what I like to try to do, Professor. I'm going to put your paper into play. What do you think of that? Either next year at this event or another event like Political Salsa, we're going to do a ranked voting for Puerto Rico within the population of Central Florida.
That's wonderful.
Okay? We're going to put this into play. Okay. So the question now is, I'd like for you to have questions. If you don't understand, we'll repeat it. If you have a question, they're really legitimate questions. So let's open up the mic. Who would like to ask a question? Go ahead, Chris.
I wonder if, do you ever think about the analogy of the WNBA might be problematic in the sense that that happens to be an organization that is being propped up by another, meaning the WNBA's success seemingly is tethered directly to the NBA. And a lot of people could say, well, what does the NBA get from that other than something on their balance sheet? So I wonder if you think about that, about your analogy, and do you see a difference there?
By the way, that's an excellent observation, right? Because WNBA is still coming up. You know, it's a much smaller league than the NBA, and you know, I'm about and I'll have to say, just because of my background through UCF, you know, I was at La Católica, and I loved it. It hurt my soul to have to leave, you know, but had the opportunity to come to Florida. And it was really for the opportunity, and so I would like the WNBA certainly to have it, you know, to have its own standing. You know what I mean, and not be so tethered to the NBA, because really talented players, right, on both sides. You know, but that's an excellent observation, and I can see how it really. I need to address that in the paper, right? Because really, Puerto Rico, whether it's a federal plebiscite, you know, whether it's a insular plebiscite. Whether it's a rank voting or traditional, you know, one man, one woman vote, you know, we're always in the shadow of that, you know, I don't want to say that imperial monster, but that imperial monster, right, that has been since 1898 sort of hovering over, and it kind of calls into question, how can you have a you know, sort of a fair election when you have that shadow looming over you? So that's a wonderful point. I will definitely put that under consideration.
Yes. Por favor, usa el,
No es que interrumpa mucho, pero no hay otra opción a esa para la decisión sobre el estatus político de Puerto Rico.
All right, so the question is,
Estamos
remember,
hablando
this is
de
state.
voto, y voto y voto, y cuántos plebiscitos se han dado, pero se da el voto, pero no hay otras opciones aparte de esta.
Right. All right, so the question is posed again, because we're recording this and this will be put on YouTube. I'll let you know, by the way, everything that we've done on this weekend is recorded. It will be on our website. We call it Public Trust Network, PTN. So you go to YouTube, get a PTN, and you'll see every interviews that we've done of everybody up to this point. But so the question he has is, well, we've had publicized in the past, and you know, we've really reached no conclusion. How would this resolve the problem? Right? Really is. So the question is, well, at least we'll have a winner. The problem is that it may not be the one who actually is the most popular, because if there's a possibility that exists under this scoring that the one that has the most points is not the first place on anybody. If you got all the second place votes, everybody's second place votes, and then everybody in the first place and third place switching around, the second place winner can be the one who wins, and now they're happy. Nobody's happy. Right?
Yeah, but by the way, that is it. That is the most powerful critique of what's called Bayesian, what I call Bayesian voting or ranked voting. That it's not if the first, this is I call it the Breonna Taylor problem now. You know what I mean? She didn't get the most first place votes. She didn't even get the most second place votes, but she ended up with the most points. I will say though, in academia, it's like. No solution is going to be perfect. And so I always remember going to the original question here. I'll never forget 1998 referendum, right? Cuando ninguna de los anteriores, right? None of the above won the plebiscite, right? Because that was the gripe, right? Free association wasn't on the ballot. Commonwealth was defined in a colonial fashion, and so the Commonwealth, most of the Commonwealth voted for ninguna de las anteriores, or none of the above. And so my solution is very problematic, because now the way I respond to it in the paper is, what do we mean by democratic, right? You know what I mean? Because right now, and this is where the Bayesian part, the philosophical part comes into play. Right now, you get one vote, and you have to basically throw it away on one choice, If you had points, and so I'm thinking of the old Netflix system, which I discussed in the paper, right, where you get to give up to 5 stars. Now it's only a thumbs up. Now it's a double thumbs up or a thumbs up, or a thumbs down. But I explain, it's what I'm trying to register here is voter intensity. How passionate are you? So the Comefuegos can give all 10 points, or whatever the maximum is to their preferred option. But people who are more ambivalent or don't want to vote strategically can allocate their points in a more strategic fashion. But I agree, right? That is a serious
Okay,
concern.
I got a question. I've never lived in Puerto Rico, and so I don't know. Okay, I like this because it's new and on my mind. But will Puerto Ricans? You're from the island, okay? Will Puerto Ricans accept this? ¿O va a tener una revolución?
Can I say something that I admire so much? Remember, I actually, you don't know this about me, but I was born in Los Angeles, and so I was coming from California, really not knowing everything. It wasn't until I went to law school in the Northeast, you know what I mean, that I became closer to Puerto Rico. And one of the things that I think Puerto Rico is really a beacon for not just Latin America, but for the world, is la Comisión de Elecciones Estatal. Puerto Rico is, I think, the only country, especially after 2016, 2020, only country you can even say in our hemisphere that has consistently run clean and honest elections for over half a century. And that is, as a professor, that is to me super, super important. And I think one of the reasons why Puerto Rico has done that is because they have adopted, new ideas, and they are, they want, Puerto Rico. I think, to me, just like Puerto Rico is the top in Bad Bunny and music, and salsa, Tito Puente, with so many top athletes and so many sports, culture, so many things. I think we'd also be an example in elections, and I think they would be predisposed. Now, I understand the stakes here are huge. We're talking about an impasse that has now over a century old, and that could give people, a lot of trepidation, even myself,
Let's ask. Anybody out there? Yolanda, I want to hear from you, Yolanda.
Thank you. Dos preguntas. Número 1, ¿cuántos plebiscitos tuvo Alaska internos antes de llegar a la estadidad? Igual que Puerto Rico los ha tenido, ¿verdad? Número 2, ¿qué perfil es esa persona que usted puede pensar que va a dividir sus 10 puntos entre 3? Porque Puerto Rico es un país muy apasionado en la política. Y si yo voy a dar un puntaje, se lo voy a dar al mío completo, yo no lo voy a dividir, ¿verdad? Así que, ¿qué le hace pensar o qué perfil es esa persona que puede dividir su ideal en 3 opciones?
That's a fantastic question for the YouTube. For the wider audience, those are 2 great questions. The example of Alaska, how many plebiscites is a referendum, how long did that go on? And then more direct question to Puerto Rico, people are passionate. I live there, I'm passionate myself, why I love Puerto Rico. Who's really going to vote non-strategic? Who's going to really allocate their points? Isn't it more likely that almost everybody's going to allocate their points to to their favorite choice? On the first one, Alaska, is a really good question. The Alaska state history, also decades. Decades. And in fact, I want to recommend I think the best paper that I've read in the last 5 years came out about 3 years ago, called Why Not More States, by a colleague in always an even number of states, 2 or 4 or 6, and always on the assumption that half of those states would be Republican and half would be Democrat. And so this is a fascinating paper. Why not more states? I really recommend that. It's a beautiful historical overview. But not only talks about Alaska, but I learned about Tennessee. I learned about Indiana. I learned about all the other 37 states. On the question of the passion, exactly right. Exactly right. I could be, and this is one of the risks of living in the ivory tower, of being on campus too much, you know what I mean? Because it's very likely, especially, in the context of Puerto Rico, where people are very passionate, that, but when I say to that, I think it's a fair point. Because we're back to where we started. If everybody gives all 10 points to their favorite option, we're back to where we started. But all it takes is one non-strategic voter, and so I could be wrong about this, how many there could be, how many would be willing to say, I'll give 5 to Commonwealth and I'll give 5 to, independents or whatever.
Question?
Or vice versa.
But
Go ahead, Chris.
even being
Last question,
non-strategic,
last question, go ahead.
even being non-strategic would be constitutional, right? So it'd be fine if people aren't non-strategic voters. Maybe that's what's comprised of the electorate, and then that's those results we get. Really quickly, because I actually had another question. I'm sorry, this is the last one.
Go ahead.
Impediments to this happening. We have a two-party system that can prevent this from ever getting on the ballot, from ever being a ballot choice. I think some people, and I wonder if you can speak to this at all, they like two choices.
Right.
When you only have two choices on things, you can, boogeyman
the
the other
problem
guy.
is that the current two-party system and only two options, which gives it is not going to get on the ballot or may not get on the ballot. So a three-party system could get on the ballot, but may end up with nothing. So with a ranked voting, that's a possibility. I just brought it up. I thought it would be interesting because I don't want to repeat the same stuff that you could just put on CD. You have the CD, go home, you can watch it, and you get the credits for it. This was an interesting discussion because it's a new idea that was posed by one of our own, okay? And I believe that we can put this into play in Central Florida.
Yeah. And if I could say that question is exactly what motivated the paper, because in the politicals, like in the Congress, right, it's a two-party system, and so you have that impasse. The executive doesn't really want to act, because it's really the executive. They don't need Puerto Rico votes. They don't need Puerto Rico's not part of the Electoral College. And the courts, I understand the courts reluctant to act because it's one thing to desegregate the schools in Topeka, Kansas, but that was really the last time the Supreme Court did a major decision that would have political ramifications, And so I thought, well, at least throw idea out there, not because, and really, I'll be honest, it's a thought experiment, I love the idea of testing it out. But it's just to get, can we find a new solution to what is, to me, the most pressing problem in our for the diaspora.
Okay, but vamos dos questions.
Just to follow up kind of what he
Okay,
was saying,
diga.
the politics of Puerto Rico. I know that in the current negotiation for the Puerto Rico Status Act, ranked choice voting was actually discussed. And the reason why it wasn't implemented was because there was pushback from representatives of Puerto Rico saying that that's not the way we vote. That's not our political system. So the current Status Act has a runoff election that if none of each choice has to get above 50, and then if they get above 50, there's no runoff. But if none of the choices get above 50, then the top two go. So that I believe that was the compromise that was made for the people that were promoting ranked choice voting. But because of the realities, the political realities in Puerto Rico and their voting system, they went with a runoff.
See, the problem from a practical point of view from here, I'm looking at this as a promotional matter. If I put this into play, it creates interest in our community, people getting involved. If we have to do it that way, the way you described it takes 2 votes, longer to organize.
Not necessarily. It could be 1 and above 50.
No, yeah, if it's possible. But it may require 2 votes. If we do it this way, we have a solution, we have an answer, and we could do it one, and we could accomplish the mission of getting the word out. Señor.
What about the vote in the diaspora? Different from Alaska. What about the Puerto Ricans in la diaspora? They will be allowed to vote?
What do you think?
Yeah, that is actually a very delicate question. Like I'm all for it. I think if we're talking about democracy, let's talk about democracy, right? But there is I'll be honest, it's a very sensitive issue in Puerto Rico.
Well, let me throw a rock into this, okay?
Yeah.
Let me throw a rock into this.
Please.
Who has the right to vote on whether or not Puerto Rico becomes a state or not. Is it Puerto Rico or us who have our congressmen? It's our senators. So you already have us, not just us, los diaspora. Every Chinese person in Wisconsin who's an American citizen is going to have the right to vote on whether Puerto Rico is a state or not a state. So if they can vote on whether or not Puerto Rico should be a state or not, why can't we vote? Ok, vamos a dejarlo ahí. Gracias y vamos. Gracias.